Welcome to the podcast, "'Tis But a Scratch, Fact and Fiction About the Middle Ages." I'm your host, Professor Richard Abels. My co-host for this episode is Peter Konitsny, co-founder with Sandra Alvarez and owner of Medievalist.net, an online website that offers readers news, articles, videos, online classes, and podcasts about the medieval world and how that history is presented today. You might remember Peter from the episodes we did on the Mongols' destruction of Baghdad and on a very strange 13th century Arabic work, The Book of Charlatans by the obscure Arab scholar and possible conman Al-Jabari. Frankly, I had never heard of that work until I was approached by Peter, and I'm very glad that he brought it to my attention. So when Peter suggested that we do a podcast on another unique medieval source, 3 independent late 14th century travel narratives of the same pilgrimage undertaken by a group of Florentine merchants, I was intrigued. Medieval pilgrimage narratives and travelogues are fairly common, but to have 3 about the same pilgrimage is anything but. Peter pointed me to an English translation of the narratives by 2 Franciscan friars, Theophilus, Bellorini, and Eugene Hoade, that were published in 1948 by the Franciscan press under the title Visit to the Holy Places of Egypt, Sinai, Palestine, and Syria in 1384 by Frescobaldi, Gucci, and Sigoli. I've posted the URL in my show notes. Peter was absolutely right. Each work is interesting in its own right, and together they are fascinating. But without further ado, welcome back, Peter, to "'Tis But a Scratch."
Oh, thanks so much for having me. Oh, I love coming on this show. So,
as I said, the pilgrimage accounts by Leonardo Frescobaldi, Giorgio Gucci, and Simone Sigoli are completely new to me. I guess that's not surprising, given that my research areas are early medieval England and more generally medieval military history. I do know that a lot of medieval accounts of pilgrimages to Jerusalem have survived. Historian Donald Howard estimated the number at more than 500. And given how small the survival rate of medieval manuscripts is, there must have been thousands of pilgrimage narratives written in the West during the Middle Ages. So what is it about these 3 in particular that caught your interest?
Yeah. So, if you're a medieval historian, you'll come across various travel logs, people doing a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. I think they kind of date back to the 6th century, and I probably have come across a few dozen of them translated over, here and there. So, and they're very typical in the sense of, they tell it, hey, we went, here, usually starting in Egypt, went up to the Holy Land. We did this. We were like, here's what's in Jerusalem. Here's what you see. Some tend to be more religious than others. Others are very practical guides. But what drew me to this is these are 3 separate accounts of the same trip that was done only by either 12 or 13 people.
Yes.
So this group of Italians in August of 1384, they make way on this trip. They first go to Venice, sail to Alexandria, Egypt, go to Cairo. From there, they go to Mount Sinai, and then up into Near East towards Jerusalem,
where they ended up spending only 4 days out of a 10-plus month pilgrimage, which I found a little bit surprising. Sorry, go on.
They do that. Eventually, they go to Damascus and then get to Beirut, and from Beirut, sail back to Venice and then get back home. They did this all in 10 months.
It's a whirlwind tour.
Yeah. So if we had one of these accounts, that would be really great as a historian, right? To have there was one of these people wrote an account of their time, but having 3 is really exceptional. And I've never come across something where we have multiple accounts of what literally is just a small scale trip with a group of people.
And I was saying to you before when we were just chatting about it, what struck me in terms of historical context is how fortunate the Florentine pilgrims were in their timing. The fall of 1384 to the spring of 1385 was a very brief, peaceful hiatus in the tempestuous and violent political worlds of both late 14th century Italy and Mamluk Egypt. In the months before Frescobaldi, Gucci, Sigoli, and the others embarked for Egypt, King Charles III of Naples was preparing to defend his claim to the throne against a major invasion by Duke Louis I of Anjou, supported by the King of France. That invasion was short-circuited by the sudden death of Louis in September of 1384. The death of Louis of Anjou proved especially fortunate for Florence. The Republic of Florence had enjoyed friendly relations with Charles III, but it recognized the military threat represented by Louis of Anjou. Florence declared its neutrality, but secretly supported Charles by releasing Sir John Hawkwood and his mercenary force, the White Company, from their service. Hawkwood immediately took service with Pope Urban VI, who was then supporting Charles. Duke Louis regarded this as treachery and ordered his mercenary captain, Enguerrand VII de Coucy, to seize the nearby city of Arezzo. The Florentines saw this as a prelude to an attack upon Florence. But then Duke Louis suddenly died. Enguerrand, for his part, took advantage of the situation by selling Arezzo to the highest bidder. Florence outbid Siena, which secured key trade routes. As an interesting coincidence, one of the Florentine negotiators happened to be Leonardo Frescobaldi. Louis's death not only saved Florence from possible conquest, but proved instrumental in transforming it into a regional power. Meanwhile, Mamluk Egypt was ruled by Az-Zahir Saif ad-Din Bark, the first sultan of the Circassian Mamluk Burji dynasty of Egypt. Bark had seized power from Sultan al-Salih Haji in 1382. For at least the months that the Florentine pilgrims were in Egypt and the Holy Land, Bark's rule was unopposed. So what we're talking about is this small period of peace in which we can have our pilgrims go off and be able to write these things, come back and tell us about them.
Yeah, I guess, these are people that probably, live in a world where there's a lot of political turmoil. And, with some of these guys that are there, it could actually affect them personally on the Italian side. But they come into Egypt. They don't, they kind of have meetings, meetings with like Mamluk officials, and they have to go through it. But like, if there's any war going on, it's going right over their heads, right? So. And I think, I've done enough Mamluk history to be like, there's more political turmoil amongst the Mamluks, what else is new, right? So, but I imagine if I was in like a regular Egyptian, like this would if they were fighting against you, amongst each other, it was probably, something that happens that doesn't really affect me because they'll still have to pay tax.
Absolutely. But what would have affected the common people as well as the pilgrims is disease. And here the pilgrimage was well-timed in another respect. Egypt, which had suffered incredibly in 1347, 1348 from the Black Death, had a recurrence of the bubonic plague in 1382. Gucci refers to it in his chapter on Cairo. Quote, "And we heard in the said Cairo an extraordinary thing, that in the plague of which we spoke of, which raged in Cairo 2 years before, they say there were many days in which in Cairo over 30,000 persons died a day." He adds that in the plague of 1347, 1348, the Black Death, that there were some days 100,000 persons would die in Cairo. Now, I wouldn't take these numbers at face value, but it's an indication of just how vulnerable a crowded city like Cairo was to the bubonic plague, and how fortunate the timing of this pilgrimage really was. As a result, the company remained healthy throughout its journey. That is, until it arrived in Damascus. In Damascus, everyone fell ill. They were so grievously ill that 2 of the company died and a couple of others only barely survived. You couldn't really escape illness, and pilgrimages to the east were always dangerous, which justified the indulgences that the church gave to pilgrims.
Yeah. So, but yeah, like, again, it's just, to me, it's so fascinating to have these accounts, and what they describe, and they're very similar accounts, right? Like, these guys aren't dealing with other kind of they're not writing very different accounts of the events, right? Like, if you can kind of follow along, this person, when we went to Cairo, this one also says we went to Cairo, right? But there are differences.
That really struck me in how each of the authors described the rule of the Sultan Bark and how he had obtained the sultanate. The accounts differ in interesting ways. All agree that Bark lacked a legitimate claim to the throne and that he obtained it in a coup d'etat. Gucci's account is the shortest. Without even naming Bark, he says that the Sultan was formerly a slave and a Greek Christian from Circassia who obtained the Sultanate, and I quote, by force and deceit and treachery, and by force as a tyrant he held tyrannically the said power, and he had killed great lords and admirals and influential men whom he doubted, end quote. Frescobaldi, whose information came from a local Christian, wrongly believed Bark to have been a Christian from Greece. In his account, when Bark, a former slave, had risen to the highest military rank, one of the 2 head quote-unquote admirals of the city of Cairo, he first ordered the other admiral killed and then had the Sultan and all his relatives imprisoned. The Caliph, however, refused to confirm him as Sultan, since the law required that a Sultan must be a Saracen and the son of a Saracen, and Bark's father was a Christian. So Bark ordered the Caliph to be imprisoned and appointed one who would confirm him. He followed this up by replacing all the Qadis whom Frescobaldi likened to bishops. Finally, he had his father fetched to him and forced him to renounce his Christian faith and undergo circumcision, quote, of which in a short time he died from pain and grief, end quote. Sigoli's account is by far the most detailed. It is also the most admiring. He begins by describing the magnificence of Bark and his court. He writes that the Sultan is a man of about 45 years old, very fine in appearance, and as strong and polite as one can say. At least 6,000 persons live in his court. He changes his garments, all of which are of great value, 3 times a day, and having worn them once, he gives them away as presents to his closest friends. He has 7 wives as well as concubines, and he sleeps with each of his 7 wives according to a schedule. When he goes hunting, he's accompanied by 100,000 men on horses, and each of them brings with them a large number of gerfalcons and pelerine falcons, pointers, and greyhounds. And he goes on and on about the wealth and magnificence of the Sultan. Sigoli's chapter on how the Sultan ascended the throne could have come straight out of Machiavelli's The Prince. Machiavelli's Cesare Borgia has nothing on Sigoli's Sultan Bark. On the other hand, there is nothing in Sigoli about Bark having summoned his father to him and having forced him to renounce the Christian faith and accept Islam and circumcision. So apparently they were getting their information from different sources. And they do have a different style. Gucci's narrative is the most straightforward. It reads very much like an itinerary, with each day's travels and attractions clearly laid out. Appended to his narrative is an itemized account of expenses incurred during the pilgrimage as information for those who wish to make a similar journey. The grand total money spent from Alexandria to Damascus came to 649 gold ducats. That is about 54 gold ducats for each of the 12 pilgrims. To give you a sense of how expensive this pilgrimage was, a single gold ducat could purchase 13 days of unskilled labor in Florence. So 54 gold ducats was roughly equivalent to 2 years' wages for a laborer. Sigoli's account is highly detailed and the most literary of the three. It's a good read. And Frescobaldi's is interesting in that his personality comes out most clearly. He came from one of the most powerful and politically influential families of Florence, and it's clear that is exactly how he wishes to be seen. Frescobaldi twice added to his original account, probably in reaction to the publication of Sigoli's and Gucci's, and each edition enhanced Frescobaldi's role in the pilgrimage. The we's of Gucci's and Sigoli's accounts are often replaced by I's in Frescobaldi. His narrative also differs a bit from the other two in details he gives about terrain and ports, and that is because he, unlike his companions, had a secondary purpose for the journey. In addition to gaining spiritual benefits, he was gathering military intel for a future crusade. Frescobaldi tells us that Bishop Onufrius of Volterra, who had been Frescobaldi's confessor when he was an Augustinian friar in Florence, took him aside before they departed and commanded him on behalf of King Charles III of Naples, who was also the titular king of Jerusalem, quote, to seek out the ports and lands overseas so that on my return I should be able to state where it is possible to find a convenient port for men-at-arms and to study rivers and places and sites for camps and terrain suitable for battleground, end quote. Bishop Onufrius had just returned from the court of King Charles, where he had gone as an ambassador for Florence. There the king had taken him aside and assured him that he was intending to launch a new crusade. Frescobaldi explains why the bishop singled him out. He writes, I am no expert in these matters, but for my sins I have found myself in 7 campaigns.
His account has a little bit more kind of details, especially when kind of meeting with Mamluk, the Mamluk Sultan and officials. He has a more of an eye for that.
Yeah.
So I guess we should just explain who these 3 writers are. So,
well, I'll start with Leonardo
yeah.
Frescobaldi. Leonardo Frescobaldi, he was born around the year 1324, and he died, maybe 1413. We're not quite sure about the dates. But he's one of the most important men in Florence, and it's because of his family. He's a Florentine nobleman, merchant, banker, and his family was one of the richest and most influential families in Florence. They were the heads of 2 of Florence's most important guilds, the Arte della Lada, the Wool Guild, the Arte di Calamala, the Guild of Foreign Cloth Merchants and Finishers. They were also very important in the city's cambio, in the money exchange business. So what we're talking about is an extremely important man. How about our other 2, Gucci and Sigoli?
Yeah, we have a guy named Giorgio Gucci, and he's also kind of described as, have a bit of government, family ties. He did a bit of diplomat work. So we don't know as much about him, but that's the kind of gist we have out about him. And the other one's named Simone Sigoli. And it also comes from a noble family, right? So again, these guys are wealthy. So there are 3, and the other rest of the group, 3 of them are also well-off people, right?
Yes.
Like there's a wool merchant, and like another kind of person that's involved in government. So we have that. Plus, there's 6 servants. That they're going like
never leave home without servants.
Yeah. I'm always wondering like who they would have picked, right? Like because you'd want if you want probably someone pretty like friendly with you, loyal to you, but you also want a young person that can handle this trip. And you probably want, and then you have people that are like, well, volunteer. Like I would think of, if your group of servants would be like, I really want to go to Jerusalem. that guy, bring him along, So it's just, so like we only have their names, right? So
Yeah.
and finally there was one priest. By the way, not all these people actually made it back. So a few of them died on the trip.
Well, it's 10 months, as you said,
Mhm. Yeah,
and there's hardships.
yeah.
Pilgrimages are not easy things. That's one of the reasons why they will gain you indulgences, is because it is a hardship to go to the holy places. So, yeah. So we have these three guys. They're heading off, and their first stop is going to be in Egypt.
Yeah, they get to Alexandria, and right away, there's like churches for them to visit, and the Christian community, and various officials to meet. So we get nice descriptions of that before like they head down up the Nile River.
Yeah, they seem to have had to meet with officials wherever they went. When they docked in Alexandria, their ship was met by 20 officials who searched their baggage and persons. The goods they carried with them were then carefully evaluated. Frescobaldi was relieved that they didn't find the 600 ducats he had hidden in a chest. After they paid a customs tax, they were brought to the house of the consul of the pilgrims, a Frenchman, where they were to reside while they were in the city. The consul of pilgrims was then ordered to escort them to the court of the Sultan's chief official in Alexandria, whom Frescobaldi terms a king and Sigoli calls an admiral. He asked why they had come, and they told him that they came to visit the Holy Sepulchre. He then questioned them about their customs, fashions, riches, the political situation in the empire, and whether it was true that there were now two popes. They answered politely but discreetly. At the end of the audience, the pilgrims asked that they be allowed to take with them a small barrel of wine, which of course was forbidden to Muslims. They must have impressed the admiral because he granted their request as a favor without requiring payment. All of this seems to have been standard operating procedure for pilgrims and overseas travelers. If they passed the audience, they received a letter of safe passage which protected them from abuse by lesser officials. There's no real sense of hostility, is there? And when they're
No, no.
meeting these officials.
Yeah, yeah. Like, like, look, I think, this was very typical. Like, first of all, Venice, they're coming from Venice, and there's a lot of, Venetian trade that's going on with Egypt, right? So, I really think, that, the Egyptians very well knew that they had a tourist economy back then. So, it wasn't.
What I found interesting is that while the pilgrims were treated well by officials and by the upper class Muslims they encountered, the same wasn't true for the lower classes. Toward the end of Gucci's account, he complains that they received insults from lower class Saracens pretty much everywhere they traveled, except for Alexandria. And perhaps that's because Alexandria was a port to the west. In Damascus, Gucci writes, quote, they first offended us with words and the worst blasphemies in their power. Then they pulled the cowls off of our heads. Then in the crowds, they would put their foot between our legs to trip us. Then those on horseback would ride the horse on us and make it bite and kick us. Then from the windows or from the ground, they threw water on us and they spat in our faces and they threw dust in our eyes and threw stones at us, hit us with canes with their fists and slapped us. And these outrages we received from servants and such villains and not from men of standing. This all sounds pretty dreadful. Oddly, this abuse is not recorded in the other two accounts. I'm not sure what Gucci's purpose was in writing this. Maybe it was supposed to be a warning to future Florentine pilgrims about what they should expect, or maybe it was to emphasize that a pilgrimage to the Holy Land was not a holiday excursion, and that one really did earn the indulgences granted for it.
Yeah, yeah. So, but yeah. It's not like there's a lot of super mixing, with the locals, right?
Yeah.
They're, they seem to have a nice, like, itinerary of, being, moved along from, church to church, and, place to place as a group, right?
So
And they
do
have,
you think that there was a standard itinerary for
uh,
pilgrims like this?
it,
I know that there
well, it
was
would
if you get to Jerusalem,
yeah,
but up
yeah.
until
I,
then, is there?
I I think they whoever they kind of were in contact with, like when they get to Egypt, or whoever kind of sets them up, knows where to go, in like in the sense, like here, say the shipmaster say, all right, you should go start here, and go to this church and go to see these people, and then they'll kind of move you along. Right, like that's my kind
Yeah.
of hunch of what's, that, like, there's always somebody, and it's not like, it's like, we're going to go to A, B, and C. It's like, you'll visit A, C, F, and H, and then, that's all the time we'll have.
And it's interesting because we think of it as pilgrimages, but it's so mixed. It's not just simply Frescobaldi scouting out possible military, but
Yeah.
it's also these are merchants. There's merchants, they're bankers, they have mercantile interests,
Uh,
and they have an eye toward business. So what they're doing is observing the local economies
uh,
and trade. They carry with them letters of credit. I mean, these
uh,
guys are looking at it from a businessman's point of view as well. And what impresses them about Alexandria and Egypt is the incredible wealth that they see.
Yeah, like Frescobaldi is very clear, like, hey, this, Cairo, there are more ships coming into its port than I've ever seen from Genoa or Venice. Like it's,
Yeah, it's
uh, you know,
impressive.
yeah, like they're like, they kind of see it like, wow, this is really well done, and they sometimes kind of mention, like, what the men and women wear, and like, oh man, they're really well dressed. So,
I had the same
and
feeling in China, by the way,
oh
during the
yeah.
summer.
They
Yeah,
people, like, it's like, the kind of, people are well off, and like, and then, they're off to see, like, the Sultan, and it's like, oh man, this is pretty opulent. So,
oh, they visit the pyramids even.
yeah, yeah. We have, so like everyone has these descriptors. They kind of move from, like, describing, like, places like of religious interest, to kind of like what do they see around, from the markets to the, and I think everybody talks about the pyramids, right?
Yeah,
And like, and I like it. I remember, there's the story there, like, oh, these were the granaries of, from the ancient Bible, right? And then one of them was like, I don't think it was. That doesn't make sense.
Yeah, yeah, that was Gucci. He was so impressed by their size that he says they appear to be works built for perpetual memory rather than granaries. Sigoli, on the other hand, had no doubt that they were Pharaoh's granaries, and he uses this occasion to retell the biblical story of how Joseph interpreted Pharaoh's dream to mean that there would be 7 years of great abundance followed by 7 years of great scarcity. The idea that the pyramids were Pharaoh's granaries goes back at least as far as Gregory of Tours in the late 6th century. Pilgrims visited them because of their association with Joseph, not simply as tourist attractions.
Yeah, yeah. Like, so, we come across it, and then, like, there's one kind of section I thought was pretty interesting, is because all three of them describe seeing giraffes and elephants.
okay, tell us about that.
Yeah, yeah. So we, again, like, all of them, like, and we come across the sections, and there's a section, like, everyone has it, like the animal, either it was like giraffes and elephants, or the animals we met, and so Frescobaldi kind of gives his version, and he says, we were in at one of the courtyards of, he describes as one of the admirals of the Mamluks. And when I don't think that there was such a title among the Mamluks, but so he's probably one of the high up military people,
Yes.
right? So they're in his courtyard, which you wish you would have a good description of, like, why are they there in that particular courtyard, but it seems to have a little bit of a zoo there. So there is an elephant. He describes an elephant tethered to a chain, and he goes on to start describing it. Says it has a tail of a goat, ears like wings of a bat, but they're as large as a cupboard, and they're hanging down like that of a bloodhound. And he also mentions they could spurt water out of their trunks. Like he was very
Yes.
impressed. So you have that. And then he goes on to say, and there were also giraffes there. He says there were three of them. He calls them meek as sheep, the cloven feet of a cow, tail of a goat, and long legs and neck, and a head like a suckling heifer.
Yes.
So you're going to see a lot of these descriptions where in this little section where they're kind of comparing it to things that people would know back home.
And there is a taste in this type of travel literature for the exotic, especially exotic animals.
Yeah.
There's a market for that.
Yeah, and I think that people were impressed, and I think we all go and visit the zoo, or when we were kids, and we were impressed, the first time we saw an elephant and stuff like that. So like Gucci, he writes this, like, they found two kinds of wonderful beasts, and he has his description, is like an elephant is very young. 4 brachia in height and weight, and a brachia, I think, kind of means about like 2 feet in our kind of hide like a wild pig, tail like an ox, huge ears. The teeth, which I think he must be describing the tusks, were cut, and a trunk like a trumpet, as thick as a man's thigh, and so it describes what it could do. And it goes giraffe. And like here's right. He describes giraffe as many giraffes, some old and some young. So that doesn't sound like 3 to me.
Yeah.
Like a camel. It tells it stands sloping high in the front and lower in the behind. So as he's a little bit of a different description, right? So then and then we have Sigoli, and I think he gave the best kind of description of them all. Yeah, his description, I think, is like the most enjoyable for us to read. And I'll just so it's going to be a little bit. So he writes, "We shall speak of the elephant, of what kind and how it was formed. The elephant has black skin like that of a cow buffalo, and is higher than one of our cart oxen. And it is bigger, its tail like that of a buffalo. Its legs are as thick as the thigh of the average man, and as are broad, almost alike below and above, and its feet are high and broad, and its neck is short and thick. Its ears are curled like the ruffs of a mantle. His eyes as big as those of an ox, the head almost like that of an ox. And from the mouth protrude 2 very big tusks, twisted like horns of an ox, save each one is fully 2 brachia long, and as thick as an ordinary man's calf. From the snout protrudes a proboscis in the shape of a music horn, and it will stretch out 8 or 9 brachia. And with this proboscis, it takes water. And when he wishes to drink, I saw it with my own eyes plunge the proboscis into a trough, and in one draught to drink up more water than a barrel of water, in less time than it would have taken you to drink half a glass of wine. And with this proboscis, it takes food and places it in its mouth. And when they travel and meet trees, there is no tree or branch so thick which the elephant strikes with its proboscis, it does not cleave at once and pull to the ground. So great is the strength of this proboscis. And if anybody approaches it so they can reach him with this proboscis, it will strike him across and throw him down a good 20 or more brachia in the air, and take him on his tusks, and he is dead." And then he goes on to talk about the guides, that they have, which can basically beat the elephants with a stick to make sure that they do their what they're ordered with. That's a really fun description of an elephant, I think.
I also found their descriptions of a giraffe interesting, and that's in part because of an article that I taught in my pre-modern World Civ class, Eric Ringmar's Audience for a Giraffe. In this article, Ringmar used public reactions to the arrival of giraffes as a lens to understand how different societies view the unknown world beyond their borders. His 3 case studies are Ming China in 1414 and 1421, Renaissance Florence in 1486, and France in 1827. Because giraffes are native only to Africa and are extremely fragile and difficult to transport, they are the epitome of an exotic animal. In 1414, the Muslim Chinese admiral Zheng He returned from an extraordinarily large naval expedition to Southeast Asia, Sri Lanka, India, Persia, and Arabia. Unlike the European expeditions of discovery that soon followed, Zheng He's voyage was not commercial but political. He was showing the Chinese flag. Impressed rulers signaled their acceptance of the distant Chinese emperor's superiority with tribute gifts. One very special tribute gift came from the rulers of Bengal, a giraffe. Giraffes are not native to India, and this giraffe was a gift to the Bengalis from the rulers of Malinda in modern-day Kenya that the Bengalis regifted to the Chinese emperor. The court literati were tasked with identifying the animal and interpreting what it was a sign of. Checking with their encyclopedias, the scholars determined that it must be a chilid, a mythological creature that traditionally was said to have a horn in its head made of flesh, the body of a deer, the tail of an ox, and the hooves of a horse, and to be of such gentle disposition that it only ate grass and never hurt a living being. This matched up pretty well to the animal that they saw before them. What clinched it was when the court scholars learned that the animal in the Somali language was known as a girin, which to Chinese ears sounded very much like chilin. Having identified the animal, the scholars could now determine what it signified. In the official Chinese bestiary, the chilin was, together with the dragon, the phoenix, and the tortoise, an animal that represented good omen. The appearance of a chilin was thus regarded as a happy portent, a sign of heaven's favor, and proof of the virtue of the reigning emperor. The arrival of the giraffe meant that the emperor enjoyed the mandate of heaven. I have a personal reason for liking this story, as the second element in my granddaughter Eileen's name is actually taken from the chilin. I really recommend the entire Ringmar article, but I don't want to get too far afield. It's interesting, though, that the arrival of a giraffe in Florence 100 years after Frescobaldi and company's pilgrimage caused a public sensation that was commemorated in poetry and painting. Okay, back to our pilgrimage narratives. Although the material that I found most interesting in the three accounts were their excursions into local customs, descriptions of cities and peoples, and the challenges of traveling through a sometimes very hostile landscape, focusing on them gives a misleading sense of what these narratives are really about. These are narratives of pilgrimages, not tourist guides. All three writers spend most of their time recounting their visits to churches and to holy spots. Of these, I found their descriptions of the churches on Mount Sinai and the Mount of the Golden Calf most interesting because of the challenge presented by the rugged terrain and the difficulty of the steep ascent, emphasized particularly by Frescobaldi and Gucci.
Just kind of tell when we look at each one, which memories got seared into their minds, right, for each one of these. And because everyone this is something they are far more vivid about than others, right? So it's very fascinating from that kind of approach.
You've mentioned this before, but it's interesting the varieties of ethnicities and the varieties of religions that our travelers encounter. They meet Christians, and it's not just one flavor of Christian. It's different types of Christians that they meet.
Yeah, this time in Egypt, Christianity is still it's not the majority, but it's a strong minority, right? And there are different kind of groups of Christians in Egypt with long-established churches, and then you have kind of like Westerners that have come and have permission from the Egyptian government to have, their own churches there or their own monasteries. So those things, they have that there. And then you have other kind of Christians from Asia that have come here also on pilgrimage or for various reasons. I don't think they mentioned, but like there would have been a large Ethiopian presence as well,
Frescobaldi actually mentions them among the varieties of Christians they encountered in Cairo. He writes, quote, "There are many generations of Christians, Latin Christians who are few, Greeks, Nubians, Georgians, Ethiopians, Armenians, and the Christians of the girdle who are baptized with fire, burning them on the head and one temple, and some on the head only." End quote. I frankly never heard of the Christians of the girdle, but the varieties of Christians are presented by Frescobaldi as just another interesting and exotic feature encountered in their travels. He immediately segues from his list of Christians to observe that in the cities of Egypt there is a great number of parrots, baboons, Pharaoh's cats, monkeys, and wildcats. It's at the very least an odd juxtaposition, connected only by that these are people and things that you wouldn't encounter on the streets of Florence. When we were chatting about this before we began recording, you emphasized to me how much of an intermingled ethnic society Mamluk Egypt really was.
The Mamluks themselves at this point are mainly coming from what's the Caucasus. And before that, it was, Central Asia. These are Turkic, Mongols that have, in their own unusual way, have wound up being the military force of Egypt.
And also rulers of Egypt, which is remarkable. Slave soldiers who become rulers.
Yeah. And one thing is your children aren't Mamluk. If a Mamluk's children aren't slaves, so once they kind of marry into like the local population, their children are like essentially Egyptian citizens. So, but they'll have, kind of their own unique looks and things like that. Like they have a bit of culture, from that. So it was a real intermingling.
Yes.
Far more than like, I think, maybe like, it'd be more like the kind of like Canada, United States, right? That kind of that kind of differences in population. So,
yeah. And the travelers are really impressed by the size of the cities and the varieties of goods that are being sold in the cities. Cairo, Frescobaldi says about Cairo that it has more people in it than all of Tuscany.
Yeah, which is probably very true. Like Cairo after the Black Death is not good for Egypt. The 14th century is generally one of really good growth for Egypt. This is like the high point.
The same cannot be said about late 14th century Florence or Italy in general. It took a couple of centuries for the population of Florence to rebound to its pre-plague numbers.
So, but yeah, like this is a good time to be an Egyptian. The markets are strong. The decline of Egypt is not going to happen until like the mid 15th century.
What I found most interesting in all three accounts are the author's observations about local customs. All three narratives are as much travelogues as they are itineraries of pilgrimages to the holy places of the East. I found them reminiscent of the travels of Marco Polo.
Yeah.
The authors present the lands they travel through as exotic, emphasizing how different it is from their native Florence. It's also clear that they viewed this alien world through the eyes of merchants and businessmen, although Frescobaldi occasionally presents himself also as a soldier or a crusader. All three were impressed by the amount and variety of food that was available in the streets of Cairo and the exotic manner in which the Saracens dined. This is especially clear in Frescobaldi's account.
In the city, there are very many cooks who cook outside in the street by night and by day in great cauldrons of copper, good meats, and no citizen, however rich, cooks at home and so do all in pagandom. And they even send to buy at these bazaars, as they call them. And often they set themselves to eat on the streets, where they spread a skin on the ground and they place the vianda in a basin in the center, and they sit around on the ground with legs crossing or squatting. And when they have soiled the mouth, they lick it with the tongue as dogs, which they are. I love it. He's praising the quality of the food, and at the same time, he's denigrating the
Yeah.
people like dogs, right?
Yeah.
And they are not content with one wife. Nay, they have as many as they can maintain, and they do not take a dowry from them. They even give a dowry to the woman according to their position. However, they do not pay them the amount, and so they make a pact on how much they ought to give each day for their living, and that amounts from 1 to 3 dirhams according to their position, and the poor have not even one. And then he goes on to some vile canards about Islamic marriage and Islamic divorce, which the source of which I have no idea whatsoever. His eye was drawn to what he saw as the peculiarities of the native customs, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
What makes them different from what he sees in Florence.
It was interesting that he spotted the Cairo cooking habits, right? Because I've read this actually in a lot of other texts, and Cairo would be what you consider the city where everybody has takeout. Yeah, no one really has a kitchen at home, right? So, and maybe the Sultan does, right? But because he has prepared, there are basically places where people cook the food, and depending on your wealth, you get better food or not, and then you'll take it home to eat or eat it outside, wherever is good. But it wasn't a place that you kept your own food. You ate out. It's a takeout culture. Man, I would have loved that.
I'm still struck by the last line in Frescobaldi's description of this dining out. And when they have soiled the mouth, they lick it with the tongue as dogs, which they are. As I said, these narratives reminded me of the travels of Marco Polo, which I guess isn't surprising, given that they, like Marco Polo, were Italian merchants. But what separates them is Frescobaldi's, Sigoli's, and to a lesser extent, Gucci's undertone of disapproval, and at least the first two's repeated likening of the Saracens to animals, which I guess shouldn't be all that surprising, given that Marco Polo was on a commercial venture while the three authors were on a pilgrimage, with one of them doing recon for a future crusade.
Yeah.
So what else impresses you about these accounts?
The main reason I wanted to bring this account to you, and I wanted to get your historian's take on this, is that there's after they're in Mount Sinai, they're heading up north towards Jerusalem, and their first stop is Gaza, but they're basically going across the Sinai Peninsula.
Right.
And so during this, what looks to have happened is they get robbed, but there are 3 accounts, and let's kind of go through how they kind of differ.
Okay.
And I want to get your take on what do you think happened?
Go ahead, give the accounts, and I will tell you what I think.
So, Frescobaldi is the first to kind of start. So, they're talking about they've traveled, they're going through it, and it's the kind of like a desert, right? It's, if you're familiar with the region, that's kind of a very between desert and very little arable land, right? So, but they've traveled 4 days. At this point, he said, we've traveled 4 days without water. We found some. They're really happy. They pitch camp. The next day, they leave at daybreak, and their guide tells the cameleers, and he calls them cameleers. Others call them slightly different, to go ahead, and they go ahead without him. And this Frescobaldi and the others are like, this is worrisome. Like, what is this guy up to? They really suspect him. So The interpreter assures Frescobaldi that they have safe conduct, everything will be fine, and they can carry on without him. And he returns late that evening to join the group. Frescobaldi mentions they saw other campfires that night, and the next morning they set out. And then at the third hour, they come across another company of people, both on horse and foot. Frescobaldi right away we're being betrayed.
This company that they come upon is armed. So it's not just simply defenseless people. They are, as he says, they're armed after their fashion.
Yes. And so Frescobaldi tells his servant right away to give him his sword and gauntlets. So he has. So funny that he has gauntlets, but I guess he could carry the rest of the armor. But the interpreter says, "Hey, he is an official from the Arabs. He wants to see your safe conduct." Frescobaldi goes and gets it from his baggage, but meanwhile, these group of people that come on them, they start to plunder the other people's stuff.
Yes,
and the camels scatter. And Frescobaldi even threatens the interpreter, and the interpreter really has to plead with him to put away his sword back in his sheath, right? So you can sense like this is a really tense moment. And he also described there's a guy with an iron mace. I'm not sure who that is, but there's this guy with an iron mace also there. But so, yeah, and then Frescobaldi goes from there. He says, the others lost some things, and they had to pay 22 ducats to have it back.
Frescobaldi concludes a little bit smugly, and having taken that money, they fled with some things of our companions, but of mine and my retinue they took nothing. And so the others could have done, since all, except for one, were younger than I.
And the group then leaves with their money and a few of the things. So our pilgrims continued north, and they reached Gaza late that night, and it was a 10-day trip. So that's Frescobaldi's account of it.
It says on several times to the interpreter that he's been betrayed by the interpreter.
Yeah.
And I know for certain that this day I must die for the love of Christ, but you will die first for the traitor that you are. And the interpreter keeps on saying, no, you got it wrong. I'm not.
Yeah. So we have that. So now we have, let's turn to Gucci's account.
Yeah.
And he says all this happened on November 11th, St. Martin's Day. He also mentions, it was the third hour. So, and that's one detail everyone gets right. It happens on the third hour. So mid-morning, right?
Yes.
I guess. Yeah. Several Saracens, he says, on horse and foot with dogs, as if going on a hunt and pretending, as he calls it, pretending to be officials. And they were checking the papers and safe conduct, start pushing the camels, pilfering the stuff, and they had to pay 15 ducats back to get most of their stuff back. So, it sounds like these people are taking things, and then there's some sort of talk and negotiation where the group, as a group, pays 15 ducats to have most of the stuff brought back to them. And then he goes,
Frescobaldi's 22 ducats.
Yes.
So, yeah.
And then he goes and he notes, like on one day before, one of the three cameleers, so not the interpreter himself, left the group to go ahead, reconnoiter ahead, because perhaps they had lost their way. And so Gucci believes that the robbers, the interpreter, and the cameleers were all in on it, and that afterwards that they split the money. That's his opinion, right? And he said it took them 12 days to reach Gaza. And then another interesting part is he actually has this big list of expenses. So someone obviously kept track of the money for everything that was spent, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and like it's very fascinating. Like, so from that we know that the interpreter's name was Ali, and he got paid 48 ducats plus 4 ducats in expenses for his part, at least for taking them from Egypt to Gaza. And that the robbery that he had to reimburse 15 ducats.
Yes.
So they also talked about they rented 14 camels and 10 donkeys for the trip. This apart from going from Mount Sinai to Gaza. This is a well-off group, by the way. So, what came across to me is 15 or 22 ducats. That's not a lot of money for them.
No, considering how much they're paying their guide, it's not that
Yeah.
much.
Yeah, like this list of traveling expenses is fairly extensive, and they seem to be having to put like money to all these guides. Every kind of official needs a little bit of money, So and just is so. It sounds like they spent like hundreds and hundreds of. I'm sure that it's actually in the number somewhere how much they actually spent, but
They're not traveling light.
yeah.
Frescobaldi says that when he reached into his bags, to get the safe conduct pass, this bag was filled with my silver cups and spoons and other delicate things. He's traveling with silver cups and spoons.
Yeah. It doesn't come across as like when you see that particular account, it seems like, man, this is a rich group, right? And are they really worried about 15 ducats, at this stage? Let's turn to our third account, Sigoli.
Okay.
So he says, like on Thursday, November 10th, their guide and the camel leaders had lost their way. So the day before this apparent mugging, we spent all day, we were turning this way and that as they're kind of going through the desert. And they pitch camp, and amongst the guides, two of them are sent different ways to kind of figure out where the road is. And then one of them returns without finding anything, but the other one comes in a little later. He says, yeah, I found the road, which is, yay, everyone's happy.
Yeah, because their provisions had begun to run low.
So they leave at dawn, and at the third hour on November 11th, this group on a horse and foot, and they say, and when these were near, their servants on foot held our camels, and finally by force and love, we were obliged to ransom ourselves for 15 gold ducats. And they took us from many things which were estimated at 6 gold ducats. And he finishes off saying they actually reached Gaza on November 14th, which would have actually been like 3 days later.
Yeah.
So Sigoli, who was normally from other parts, is such a good writer, he offers the kind of least information. So
yeah.
I would just add that Sigoli believed that their Turkoman guide got them lost on purpose so that they could be robbed. His account is also the only one that doesn't say that this band of men on horse and foot claimed to be officials of the Sultan.
What do you think that is?
It's also really difficult to reconcile Sigoli's account with what he wrote about the Sultan Bark. There he claimed that since Bark became Sultan, quote, you can go through all his territory with gold in hand, so much as he feared, and so well does he give right and justice to all manner of people, and there is no place so deserted, nor so rough, where one cannot go safely. Verily it is true that you should have a Turkoman to guide you, and take good care that he be a man of good repute, and you may go safely whither you will. I guess the way of reconciling this is to say that they did not have a Turkoman of goodwill.
His memory might of it be a little askew, right? Like, or he didn't understand what was happening.
Which is quite possible. It appears that the interpreter was speaking directly with Frescobaldi and was with Frescobaldi during this whole event.
Yeah.
So it might have been confusing to everybody else in the group.
Yeah.
And it's interesting also that apparently of all of the people there, Frescobaldi is the only one who drew his sword.
Yeah. Did you notice that the editors, they called him hot-headed?
Ah, that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if it's actually just based on what they read here, or if he really was hot-headed from other sources. So.
But he's glad that he drew his sword because he points out that while everybody else had to pay and ransom back their goods, he didn't.
Yeah. And, so like you get from Sigoli is like, oh, this group came up and, all of a sudden, like they're holding on to our stuff, and we had to. I don't know how the translation of force and love comes up about, but like maybe by threats and persuasion, maybe that's what I'm trying to think
Yeah.
is the meaning behind it, that they get paid 15 ducats. And I don't know what reasoning there is. Like they said, we need 15 ducats for you to go through, and some of them wind up taking stuff. And I'm wondering if, like they took it brazenly, or like they found out later that like 15 ducats, because they seem to have taken goods and then they gave back the goods. But I don't think anyone was there checking at the time, hey, is my silver spoons all there, right? So,
It doesn't seem like a toll. It doesn't seem like a standard toll for crossing
yeah.
Sinai. It is kind of curious, and the reason why at least Frescobaldi thinks that they're betrayed is because all this happens after they have one of the camel drivers
Yeah.
go out of camp.
And that's one of the most kind of confusing, because all three individuals have different, accounts of who left at what time, right?
Yeah.
So that's a really kind of fascinating part. And like sometimes, like I think Frescobaldi is the best one to trust, because he just talks with people and he remembers conversations. But like others, like like no one. Like Sigoli is the only one that kind of really explained that. Like we were kind of lost, we're like wandering around. We don't know where we're going. So
That seems quite appropriate given that they were in Sinai.
it's interesting, like who's remembering what details, and they don't often match, but they're close. It's funny, they never talk to the, like what they call the Sultan in Gaza, which is like the kind of like a governor of that, like about what happened to them. They get wined and dined for a couple of nights. But whatever this incident happens, it doesn't. They don't relate it to him, at least in our record.
They may have thought that they got out of the scrape pretty cheaply. Nobody was hurt, and only a few of their goods was taken, and Frescobaldi's goods were not taken at all. And, as you point out, 15 or 20 ducats is really nothing to these guys. Okay, you began by asking me what I, as a historian, thought really happened based upon these narratives. Okay, here's my best guess. Although all three accounts represent what happened to them as highway, or at least desert track robbery, by a band that falsely represented themselves as officials, I suspect that may have been a little bit of both. Gucci says that the men who approached them were accompanied by hunting dogs, which would be very odd for a robber band. They also demanded that the pilgrims show them the Sultan's letters of safe passage, which would have been totally unnecessary for a robber band. But most telling is that the pilgrims survived the encounter, and with most of their goods and wealth intact. It would have been easy enough for an armed band to have killed all of them and taken everything. The encounter is not presented as the taking of a toll from a group of merchants in transit across Sinai on their way to Gaza. But that might have been what the payment of 15 ducats actually was. While absconding with some of the goods from the baggage, and only from those who didn't resist, may have just been petty theft. And perhaps that is why the pilgrims didn't report the incident to the officials in Gaza. Anyway, that's my take on it. And they couldn't have been all that surprised that they got mugged. After all, we're talking about wealthy Italian pilgrims who have local guides, don't speak the language, and really don't even know where they are.
Yeah. Like these people, like they're wealthy, right? Like, and they don't go light. They'll spend the money on the extra camels and guides here and there. So these kind of groups, they don't know where they're at because they don't speak the local language. They have to rely on interpreters. They're seeing places for the first time. It's just tricky on them, right? Like when I go traveling and I go to a place for the first time, I'm very much lost, right? Like I don't, I don't know what's around the corner, right? So I'm unfamiliar, and you kind of have to rely on people to a greater extent than you would, if you were at home.
Well, that might explain the purpose of writing these.
Mm.
It's guidebooks for future
Yeah.
pilgrims, and it might be
Yeah.
guidebooks for Florentines.
Uh,
I mean, all three of these men are Florentines,
yeah,
and
and
this is a period in which you could expect that maybe their family members would follow them,
yeah.
and it's also just simply a literary project.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Anyway, I think we are coming to the end. Any last thoughts about these accounts that you want to share with the listeners?
I think I'll never kind of fully piece it together, but I enjoy it for what it is, trying to figure out what's in people's minds, what were they thinking, how are they reacting to things. So, there's so many little things that you appreciate from just a little incident as like highway robbery
Yes.
or what a giraffe looks like.
So we have come to the end of another episode of Tis But a Scratch, Fact and Fiction about the Middle Ages. I'd like to thank my guest and co-host for this, Peter Kniske. Peter, thank you very much for joining me again.
Oh, thanks so much.
And until next time, bye for now.